Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Norden. Thank you for joining us on this episode with Ellen Zachos, author and forager. Ellen joins us to talk about her new book, Mythic Plants, Potions and Poisons from the Garden of the Gods. Ellen Zachos is a Harvard graduate and author of 8 books, including Backyard Foraging, The Wild Crafted Cocktail, and The Forager's Pantry. Ellen teaches foraging workshops across the U.S. and around the world. She started her career as an actor on Broadway in New York City, but decided she really wanted to be a horticulturalist. After earning certificates from the New York Botanical Garden, she started her own business, designing, installing, and maintaining gardens in New York City. Eventually, Ellen discovered foraging and ventured out into the wilds of Central Park, the woods of Pennsylvania, the deserts of New Mexico, as well as the islands of Scotland. After which, she started her second enterprise, Backyard Forager. Ellen joins me from her home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to discuss the plants and the gods of ancient Greece. Ellen, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast. Before we get to the gods of ancient Greece and the mythic plants they used, let's start with you and the work you have been doing as a backyard forager. You are a gardener, an author, and a longtime forager. What inspired you to first start foraging, and how has that led to your career?
First of all, Stefan, thank you very much for having me. My career is something that my husband likes to say I kind of just made up. When you are a creative person or an independent contractor, you just kind of cobble together all the things that you like to do and that you're good at doing, and you hope that you're going to be able to make a living at it. I started foraging because I was a professional gardener. And I was a professional gardener because when I was on the first national tour of Les Miserables, somebody gave me a plant as an opening night gift instead of a bouquet of flowers. I fell in love with plants, and when I didn't want to be an actor anymore, I went back to school at the New York Botanical Garden and learned how to design, install, and maintain rooftop gardens in New York City. A woman who was working for me was a forager, and on our lunch break one day, she reached over and picked up a leaf of garlic mustard and suggested I put it in my sandwich, which I did. And it was so good and improved my sandwich so much that I decided I needed to learn more about wild edible plants, and that sent me down the road to become a forager.
So people have been foraging from the beginning. What have we been losing, or what have we lost since we stopped the common practice of foraging?
First of all, I think foraging is a confusing term to a lot of people. We talk about earlier cultures being hunter-gatherers, and foraging was simply the gathering part of that. People who did that in a traditional way were so much more in touch with their environment, with the seasons. with how they, as human beings, fit into the place where they lived. They knew what that place tasted like. They knew where to find the nutrition that they needed. We don't know that anymore, or very few of us do. And what we're missing is not just delicious food, which I call unbuyable flavor. I mean, these are things that you cannot find at any supermarket. It's not just that we're missing, but we have also lost our connection to our local environment, whether it's Central Park in New York City or the Rocky Mountains in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we've lost our connections to seasonality. We can all look out the window and see, oh yeah, it snowed, so I'm not wearing sandals out today. But when you understand which seasons produce which foods, that's a more intimate connection between you and the nature that surrounds you.
So today we're talking about your new book, Mythic Plants. What might you add as an introduction about the book that we're going to talk about?
People say, what's it about? And I say, well, the subtitle is Potions and Poisons from the Gardens of the Gods. And that tells you something. But it doesn't tell you everything, because plants 2,000 years ago were not just a source of food. Some of them seen as having magical properties. They were the only thing we had for medicine. Plants really were essential to daily life for everybody, for royalty, for slaves. And there were many, many enslaved peoples in Mythic times. And all of them used plants for something every day. There was a much greater connection to the plant world back then. In Mythic Plants, we look at all kinds of stories, some that are completely fantastical, some that are essential and basic to everyday life. Some plants still actually are used in the same ways that they were used 2,000 years ago.
So in ancient Greece, there seems like there was a god for just about everything. Was there a god of plants?
No, but yes. There was no one god of plants, but there were several gods that were considered vegetation gods. And the two primary vegetation gods were Dionysus, who was also the god of wine and the god of theater, and Demeter, who was the goddess of the harvest. She is considered responsible for introducing grain and how to grow it to the ancient Greeks. He was a big one because once people knew how to cultivate grain, they didn't have to forage or gather quite so much of the wild grains or the acorns or the nuts. They were able to produce a dependable crop more often. And as far as Dionysus goes, wine was an essential crop. He also had a lot to do with other plants as well, with fennel, with ivy. There are stories about these two gods relating to many different plants. There were plants that were sacred to other gods and goddesses. Both the rose and the mandrake plant were sacred to Aphrodite. Chaste tree, Vitex, was sacred to Hera. There were a lot of connections between different gods and different plants. But I would say that Dionysus and Demeter were the two main vegetation gods that you see coming up again and again.
So in the book, you do separate the plants into different groups and different identities. And you start with the intoxicants, such as mandrake, cannabis, and opium poppy. Can you share with us some of the stories and the myths of these plants and how they help shape the culture of the time?
I'm not sure I can speak to how they shape the culture of the time, but I can definitely fill you in on how they were used and some of the stories associated with them. For instance, you've probably heard of the oracle at Delphi, right?
Uh-huh.
So people would go to Delphi and they would ask earth-shattering questions like, what do I have to do to win this war? Or how can I appease the gods who have been punishing my family for generations? Big questions. But there were other oracles too. And there was one oracle in the north of Greece called the Oracle of the Dead. People would go there if they just needed to communicate with loved ones that they had lost. And part of their preparation to be able to do this was to go to the oracle and stay there for a couple of weeks and perform all these rituals that the priests would lead them through. And these rituals were supposed to prepare them to be able to speak with someone who had passed away. And those rituals included things like eating very specific foods and breathing in smoke from cannabis and hashish. And we know that because remnants of hash have been found at the place in northern Greece where they have determined the Oracle of the Dead was. So that to me is fascinating, that it was respected part of a religious ritual. But there are also stories, one of my favorites is from Herodotus when he's talking about the Scythians, who were a warlike culture, nomads, fantastic horseback riders who lived along the Black Sea. He describes in great detail how, for them, smoking cannabis was a ritual of joy. And they would create these tents with a fire pit of burning coals. And they would throw the cannabis onto the coals and they would duck under the tent and they would breathe in this smoke. And he describes them as crying out with joy because it was just so much fun. You've got religion, you've got recreation, and then you have the Thracians, who were from the land just to the north of Greece, who had warriors known and priests known as the smoke walkers. It is believed that the smoke that they walked through to get their visions to help them be victorious was cannabis smoke. You can add warfare to recreation and religion. Cannabis was used in so many different ways in ancient Greece.
Of most of the plants that you share in the book, were they cultivated by the Greeks or was foraging still a prominent activity?
I think both were really important. There were some things that were definitely cultivated. Grain was cultivated, barley was cultivated, medicinal herbs like pennyroyal were cultivated, apples, pomegranates. But there were other things that the Greeks couldn't grow. Mandrake was generally foraged. Actually, they used dogs to dig it up because humans thought they would be harmed if they dug such a powerful herb. One of the other things that I think most people don't understand is that Greece was not the small Mediterranean country that it is today. You have to think about Greater Greece, which extended all the way from the Black Sea and Ukraine to coast of North Africa to Marseille in France. And so when you think of all these different places that had been colonized from the Greeks, you can imagine how many different kinds of plants grew in those places. You weren't restricted to just one environment. You had high mountain, cold temperatures, desert, lots of rain, coastline, saltwater, fresh. You had everything. And a lot of these plants were very important trade items. You had the Greeks using things like myrrh that they couldn't grow, they had to import. So really cultivated, sure, but not just in the Greece that we know today, but from all throughout the Mediterranean and beyond.
What were some of the culinary treats from the land of Odysseus, such as cornelian cherry, figs, and acorns?
I like that you chose those three because they are very differently viewed today. Cornelian cherries are still considered a food treat in some cultures, especially Eastern European cultures. It's still used in Persian cuisine as a sour juice that they make sherbet with. It's a wonderful flavor. It makes a great jam. It has a ton of natural pectin. But then you look at something like figs, which everybody loves today. Everybody still knows what a fig is. It's not seen as being a mythic food or an unusual food. And then that's in sharp contrast to acorns, which today really, at least in the United States, only foragers eat acorns. And of course, I'm a forager and have acorns in my freezer right now. It just goes to show you that the plants that were used as food in ancient Greece, many of them are still used today. Some are seen as really fringy, like for foragers, and others, like figs, are considered a delicacy. And you'll find them at farmers markets and grocery stores all over the country.
So the gods of ancient Greece had a very interesting relationship with plants. What were some of the more interesting ways that the gods used plants to get what they wanted?
Just to clarify, the gods didn't eat any of these plants because the gods didn't need to eat or drink anything except ambrosia. And as far as I can tell, ambrosia is something mythical. We don't know what that was or what the ancient Greeks thought it was. The way they used plants, they didn't need them as medicine, but they used them as tools to manipulate human beings. And one of my favorite stories about that is about the Narcissus. I had mentioned Demeter already, who is the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter was Persephone. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter and Zeus. And yes, Demeter and Zeus were brother and sister, but apparently that was okay back then. Persephone's out picking flowers one day, and she sees the plant, and she cannot resist it because it's a narcissus with 100 flowers. And you and I both know, Stefan, that narcissi do not produce 100 flowers, but this was a narcissus produced by Zeus specifically to lure Persephone to look at it, to come close. And when she got there, the ground beneath her opened up, and Hades arrived in his chariot, plucked Persephone from the ground, and brought her to Hades, where she was going to be his queen. This was a plan that he had worked out with his brother Zeus, and Zeus was like, yeah, okay, sure, you marry my daughter, and let's just kidnap her and take her down to Hades, where she will be your queen. And so he created that plant to manipulate Persephone. It didn't work out exactly the way he wanted because Demeter was so upset. She decided, all right, fine, you're not going to give me back my daughter. I'm just going to kill all the plants on Earth. And Zeus knew that very quickly that meant that humans would all die and there would be nobody left to worship the gods. So he said, all right, Hades, you have to send Persephone back for at least part of the year. And here's where they used a plant again to manipulate humans. Because what Hades did was he said to Persephone, okay, you can go back up, you can stay with your mom, but here, aren't you hungry? Would you like some pomegranate seeds first? And she said, yes, I would. I'm very hungry. And she ate some pomegranate seeds because she didn't know that each seed that she ate meant that she would have to stay in the underworld for a month every year. And that is how the ancient Greeks explained the dormant season, when plants didn't grow and after the harvest and before the next crop came in, that was winter. And that was when Persephone had to return to the underworld because she had eaten 3 or 4 or 6 pomegranate seeds. And during that time, Demeter mourns her loss and nothing grows on earth. So that's one of my absolute favorite stories, not only because there are so many plants involved, but because it really shows how the gods used those plants to manipulate human beings, make the humans do what they wanted, or to punish a human, or to reward a human. Sometimes they would reward a human by turning that human being into a plant when they died, or sometimes they would punish a human by turning that human into a plant. They use plants all the time.
So do we have an idea of how available these plants were to the average family or person? Or were they reserved for the elite?
I think the answer is both. There were some plants that were incredibly rare and expensive. There was one plant called Philphion, which was worth more than its weight in gold or silver. Your average Stavros was not going to be able to have Philphion on his table. But a lot of the medicinal herbs were very common and were available to regular people through their midwives, through their doctors. The elite would certainly have had more easy access to them, just as they had easier access to everything, even today. But I think these plants were known across the boards, even to your average peasants.
And in the book, you refer to gifts of the gods. What were some of the gifts of the gods?
I have a couple of favorites there. One of them is giant fennel. The story that goes along with giant fennel is that Prometheus, who was a cousin of Zeus, he wasn't one of the Olympians, but he was a Titan, which was an earlier god. He felt that Zeus was too hard on human beings. He thought human beings should be able to have fire as a tool because it would allow them to cook meat and it would allow them to stay warm. So he went up to Mount Olympus with a stalk of giant fennel, and he went into Hephaestus's workshop. Hephaestus was the blacksmith of the gods and had a fire burning at all times. And Prometheus stole a coal from Hephaestus's fire and brought it down to earth inside a stalk of giant fennel. And the reason I love this story is because giant fennel does indeed have a very wide stalk. It can be 2 to 3 inches wide, and it's got a pit inside that will not catch fire, but will hold the burning coal and not let it go out. Prometheus flew back down to earth and gave the gift of fire to man, but he needed the giant fennel to do it with. He was punished and tortured for millennia for doing this. Zeus was not happy, and that was really a gift from one of the gods to human. The olive tree is another one of my favorites. The olive tree was the gift of Athena. Both Athena and Poseidon wanted to be the patron god of Athens, so they were each told they had to bring a gift. And whichever gift was deemed better, that person, that god, would be the patron god of Athens. Poseidon took his trident and he struck the ground with it, and up bubbled a spring of salt water. And Athena took her spear and she struck the ground with it, and her spear turned into an olive tree. And you might think, ooh, water, that's important. That's pretty good. But remember, Poseidon was the god of the sea, so that's salt water. And salt water wasn't particularly useful. You couldn't drink it. You couldn't water your crops with it. But olives were fantastically useful. The wood was useful. The fruit was a good food. And the oil was used for lighting, for medicine, and for grooming. People would apply it to their skin if they were athletes, or sometimes the goddesses just did it to make themselves more alluring. Athena won that, and the town was named after her. And those two, I think, fennel and olives, are my two favorite gifts of the gods.
Are there any other plants that we have not mentioned that you have found especially interesting?
Yes, there are. One of them is the plant called moly, and that's spelled M-O-L-Y. A lot of people have read Circe, that a very popular novel, and it actually makes an appearance there. When Odysseus lands on Circe's island, he sends his men off to explore, and they don't come back. And he's a little worried. So he decides he's going to go look for his men. As he's walking, he runs into Hermes, who is the messenger of the gods. And Hermes says to him, dude, hang on a second, because if you go right now, the same thing's going to happen to you that happened to your men. And what happened to your men is Circe turned them into pigs. I'm going to help you. And shows Odysseus this plant. He says, it's got a white flower. It's got a black bulbous root. It's very difficult for men to dig up, but gods can do anything. And for centuries, classicists and botanists have argued about what this plant could be. And I'm going to tell you right now, I think it is snowdrop, Galanthus nivalis. And I say that for many reasons, but the short version is it has a white flower, it has a black round bulb, and it goes dormant. You might wonder, why is Hermes saying to Odysseus, it's difficult for humans to dig up, but not for gods? Well, if a plant is dormant and it's not showing any growth above ground, how is a human being going to know it's even there? You can see it in the spring when it first comes up. But where I used to live in the Northeast, snowdrops come up in February and March. By May, they pretty much died back. You can't see them anymore until the following spring. If it's that plant, that would make it very difficult for a human to dig up. But of course, gods know everything. The clincher is Circe turning Odysseus' men into pigs Could she really do that? I mean, really? Can somebody really be turned into a pig? I'm pretty skeptical. But as an herbalist and a witch, there were certainly plants that Circe could have used to make Odysseus's men think they were pigs. Snowdrop contains a compound that is the antidote to that kind of mass hallucination. And I just love that. Today, the plant compound is called galantamine, and today it's being studied to use in treating people who have Alzheimer's. And I love the fact that a plant that we know, just as a garden ornamental, that's native to the Mediterranean, that fits the description in Homer and in Theophrastus, actually contains something that could have counteracted the mass hallucination imposed on Odysseus's men by an experienced herbalist. How cool is that? Seriously, how cool is that?
In the book, you say that you have been to the top of Mount Olympus. What did you find up there?
A friend of mine said, I want to climb Mount Olympus. Do you want to come? And I said, sure. I didn't have any sneakers or hiking boots, but I borrowed some. And it was amazing. You spend the night before in this big lodge, and it's one giant room with just bunks all the way around it. So you're sleeping in this room that would hold 40 or 50 people. They're all strangers. You don't know any of them. And you get up very early the next morning to climb up because you want to be down before the clouds come in. The clouds come into Mount Olympus in the summertime about every day around 2:00. You have to start early. And even in August, there's snow on Mount Olympus. It was a magical place. I'm really glad I got to go there.
Could you sense the gods?
Well, I don't actually believe in any god of any kind. So I would not say that I could sense God, but I could sense that it was a very special place. And it was very easy for me to understand why people might think this was a sacred spot.
Before we let you go, I would like to share just how beautifully your book is illustrated. Who illustrated it, and how did that come about?
So the illustrator's name is Liesl Ashlock. And choosing an illustrator, if you're lucky, is a cooperative endeavor. You know, when you're working with a publisher and an editor, that you always disagree about certain things, but both my editor and I agreed that Liesl was our first choice. She's enormously talented. The illustrations are fantastically beautiful. But what I love about them is they combine exactly the right amount of botanical accuracy with imagination and fantasy appropriate to the god. She has both of those things. She told me when we first started working together that she has an 8-year-old son who loves mythology, and I felt very good knowing that she was somebody who would respect the mythology and also had this tremendous talent for illustrating.
So lastly, how much fun did you have putting this book together? And what do you hope the reader will take away with them?
That was the most fun I've ever had writing anything. It's my 11th book. It was so much fun because as I did the research, and there was a lot of research, I learned so much. And the idea that you can learn a lot while you're teaching other people is exhilarating to me. So that was wonderful. I hope the reader will be entertained. I hope the reader will say, wow, that was a great story. Let's look at the next one. But I also hope that it will make readers think about how and why myths are created. Every culture has its own mythology. And there are things that are common to every mythology. There are creation myths. There are stories about where the sun goes when it goes down and where the moon comes from. There are always stories created to explain what these people saw in the natural world around them. And I think if you look at those stories through the lens of horticulture, you understand much better what these people were trying to explain. They needed explanations for things they didn't understand. And by looking at the plants around them and working with them and figuring out the properties of those plants, it helped them make sense of their own world. So I think at the end of this book, I would like people to believe that many of these myths are actually based in reality, and that reality is often attached to something from the plant world.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Ellen Zachos, sharing from her new book, Mythic Plants, Potions and Poisons from the Garden of the Gods. And I hope you get the opportunity to read this wonderful book and to visit her website, backyardforager.com, to learn more about the incredible world of foraging. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan. And I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.